Last class, I introduced the topic of ideology, and we explored the function that ideologies serve. The cartoons we examined were rather obvious examples of ideologies, at least in the eyes of educated adults like yourselves, although others fully believe the ideologies of manifest destiny and pluralism. However, most ideologies, like the culture of poverty, are presented to us in far more subtle ways. So let's start with a quick review. Think back to when we examined the structural versus cultural perspectives on inequality. Recall that the structural perspective on race and poverty focuses on unequal opportunities and competition. On the other hand, there's the cultural perspective, and this is where you'll find the culture of poverty ideology. Let me just summarize what is meant by the culture of poverty. In this instance, the cultural perspective all boils down to, quote, bad values as an explanation for inequality. The culture of poverty theory states that a culture that devalues hard work, discipline, ambition, and sacrifice for the future, that results in laziness. And this laziness results in poverty. Moreover, this culture of laziness and poverty is socialized and it's passed down from one generation to the next, which is why it's called the, quote, culture of poverty. So the assumption here is that the poor are poor not because of structured inequalities, but because they are lazy, and they and their children are likely to stay that way. The implied counterpoint to this is the idea that the rich are rich because they're hardworking, and they and their children are likely to stay that way. So what we've done in our society is we've taken the idea that laziness results in or leads to poverty, and we've turned it around so that we also believe that poverty gives rise to laziness. Now, there are two big problems with this theory. First of all, there's an underlying assumption that links poverty with particular races. And so we come to associate poverty and the laziness that goes with it with that race, African, Latinx, and Native Americans in particular. Asians are not because they're currently set aside as the model minority. This racial group is held up as an example of, quote, good values, especially as represented by the stereotype of the tiger mom, which some of you read about for the previous topic. We also speak in a code of euphemisms, such that we say things like inner city, which is an economic reference, and what we hear is and think about would be people of color, Black people, Latinx, and Native Americans. The second result is the fact that we blame the victims. We think the poor are poor because they're lazy, not because there's something wrong with the system or because they had unequal opportunities to begin with. And when we blame the victims, we justify or legitimate inequality by finding defects in the victims of inequality. We can feel better about ourselves when we assume others are solely responsible for their own failure to get ahead. So, this theory, the culture of poverty, is very negative toward the poor and racially oppressed. And because of this negative perspective and the fact that it doesn't take social structure into account, Steinberg, the author of the reading I had you complete for today, is highly critical of using culture and values as an explanation for inequality. On the other hand, there are some things that are informative about this culture of poverty theory. For example, you can use the economic class of a parent to predict the future economic success of a child. Something is passed down. At the very least, the disadvantage itself is passed down. But this is also true of the wealthy. Something is passed down there as well. And then there really are some people out there who are lazy and who don't want to work. In other words, we can't entirely dismiss this culture idea. Yes, structural factors, the fact that people have unequal opportunities, that's very, very important. But is it the entire picture? So, How do we reconcile these two opposing perspectives? Or can we? Let's focus on this laziness idea. The culture of poverty theory tells us that poor people are lazy. But are all poor people lazy? And are all lazy people poor? So if you think critically about it, you begin to realize that a big part of the problem has to do with the name of this theory, the culture of poverty. This name automatically links a culture characterized by laziness with one class of people, the poor, as if you can't have one without the other. And yet, if not all lazy people are poor, such a connection is very misleading. And this distinctively American ideology was so strong that for many years it never occurred to even social scientists to ask whether the rich could also be lazy. And yet we hear things like the, quote, idle rich. Aren't the rich being lazy if they're idle? So given this problem, one clever sociologist by the name of Chandler Davidson decided to propose a different name for this cultural perspective. He suggested that instead of calling it the culture of poverty, we rename it the culture of shiftlessness. And suddenly, with this one simple change, the idea of being lazy or shiftless was no longer linked with just poverty. Now it was possible to study this culture no matter what class the person happens to be from. So now we can ask whether this culture of shiftlessness is more or less likely to be found among the poor than the rich, and by implication, among one race versus another. Before he renamed this perspective to the culture of shiftlessness, it didn't even occur to anyone to ask that question. Talk about constructing reality. So, in his research, Davidson compared people from different class and racial backgrounds with regard to their work ethic and found that there was no statistically significant difference in terms of work values between the poor and non-poor in any racial or ethnic category. If anything, he found that ethnic minorities on average expressed more support for work-oriented values than the white majority. The marginalized know they have to work and work harder than white people if they're going to succeed. There's an article that I'm going to read from for you titled Great Expectations: How the Public and Parents, White, African American, and Hispanic, View Higher Education. In the article it says, quote, all Americans say higher education is important, but our survey shows that African American and Hispanic parents are significantly more likely than whites to emphasize the value of higher education, not less. And then if you go into the survey itself, there's a question. If you had to choose one thing that could most help a young person succeed in the world today, would you say it is a college education, knowing how to get along with other people, a good work ethic, or work skills learned on the job? Okay. What's really interesting is that the percentage of white high school parents who thought that a college education was the most important thing, only 33% of these white high school parents agreed. 47% of black high school parents thought that college education was important. And then 65% of Hispanic high school parents felt that college education was important. Another question asked, do you think that a college education is necessary for a person to be successful in today's work world, or do you think that there are many ways in which to succeed in today's work world without a college education? Again, 32% of white high school parents felt that a college education is necessary for success, whereas 44% of black high school parents thought that college was necessary for success. And again, 65% of Hispanic high school parents felt that a college education is necessary for success. In other words, shiftlessness or laziness is no more common among poor people or African, Latinx, or Native Americans than any other class or race or ethnicity. But Davidson did find a difference between racial groups. He found that, surprise, some groups got paid more money and other compensations for their work than other groups, and those groups were middle to upper class and white. In other words, some people have better opportunities than others. That's the kind of data that's in direct support of the structural perspective. So, given all this evidence, we can ask, why is it that the culture of poverty idea persists in our society? The reason it persists is that it is an ideology that rationalizes the unequal distribution of wealth in the United States. And just like all ideologies, it influences our perceptions of facts. It distorts our impressions of what's really going on. Using phenomenology, it is a constructed reality that is inaccurate, but one that persists because it serves some people's interests, the interests of people with power and privilege. In fact, this ideology is so ingrained in U.S. culture that you will still find the culture of poverty being taught today, which I find very irresponsible. You'll notice it being discussed as a legitimate theory in the podcast that's assigned for this topic. I also had a social work student who was taking this course tell me that in her internship placement, the training for her internship, they were talking about the culture of poverty as if it's real. So it's still out there. It still holds a lot of sway in the minds of the public. Now, to illustrate this difference between the cultures of poverty and the culture of shiftlessness, I had you read a case study of an individual who is typical of this shiftlessness problem. This case study is intended to highlight how our impressions are distorted by the way we portray a person in light of this culture of poverty ideology. I had you read it. I want you to think about and pay attention to how this person was described. Look closely at all of the labels that are used. The facts of the story are all true and come from her official biography, but there's a lot of loaded language that distorts our impressions, and it's written that way on purpose because that's how the poor are talked about in our society. The case study is written in this way because that language is typical of the way we talk about the poor and other marginalized groups. What I'm going to have you do now is pause and answer some questions about the case study, and then we can move on to the second part of the video.